Hello, welcome back. I'm David Scheinbaum from Scheinbaum and Russick. And I remind you again that all these videos correspond with a full write-up and descriptions and close-ups and details that are on our website, which is photographydealers.com. Today's talk, I'm kind of calling a few different things, but it's loosely called I Saw It for Less. It could also be called How Many Are There? Those kind of questions are very common when visitors come to a gallery, and those are especially people who are not used to collecting photography. That's what they do. Oh, I saw it in a catalog, or I saw it in another gallery and it had a different price, or how many could the photographer make? And of course, in the days of traditional photography, analog photography, we'll see today if you all did your homework. In the last few videos, I tried to talk to you about various print sizes. I tried to explain to you different processes, how different cameras produce different photographs, and I also explained why most of the kind of classic 20th century photographs tend to be small. And all those things combined add to value. The other things that add to value could actually be a little overwhelming today, and it's not my goal to overwhelm you. It's my goal to try to bring up things that you as a collector should know. And it shouldn't be, oh, there's too much to know, I'm not going to bother. After today's video, I hope maybe you start looking at some books. When the COVID virus is finished, you could start go visiting galleries, visiting museums, because the more prints you look at, the more you will learn connoisseurship about prints and print quality. And that's as simple as, think of a photographer who's making a print for a local newspaper because they want to write something about their exhibit. That photographer will probably make a quick print and send it to the newspaper. But imagine a photographer that's having a show at a major museum. The print for that show is going to be probably the best print they ever made. Now, it will be the same picture, but prints are different. And that's why we say when you're collecting photographs, you're not just collecting images, you're also collecting prints. And what you need to learn about prints is, are they vintage? Are they modern? Was it printed by the artist? Was it printed by a printer? Is it posthumous? Was it made by a family member after the artist passed away? Was it a limited edition? Was it from a book? Was it from a portfolio? What's the condition of the print? How is it mounted? What kind of stamp was used on the back? All this information tells us about the lineage of the photograph, or the word we use is provenance, or the provenance of the photograph, and all of that adds to the value. Another way to learn this, and I'm not criticizing any way to buy photographs, but if you have a local gallery, most photo dealers around the world are members of an organization called APAD, Association of Fine Art Photography Dealers. Their website, you could see those dealers listed. Any of the dealers that are members of that organization will be glad to begin teaching you. You'll visit their gallery, they'll show you prints, they'll show you different states of prints, they'll show you different vintages of prints. It's a good way to learn. It's a little overwhelming if you just look in a catalog, every picture's reproduced the same size. You may not know the vocabulary or the language. Of course, a lot of people now are looking online, the various buying sites. You have to be careful. You really have to know what you're doing. There are bargains to be had, but not for everybody. In fact, more often than not, people end up with not what they thought. So let me just bring up a lot of this today, begin the conversation, and then I hope you'll follow up by trying to learn a little more about what goes into a price of a print. And it's not just the picture. It's a whole lot of other things that may make sense or may not. I'm also going to revisit some of the artists I've shown you in the last few videos, but today we'll start talking a little more about value. So this is a Beaumont Newhall photograph we've seen before. If you've been watching our videos, this is a portrait of Henri Cartier-Bresson. This is a vintage photograph. In Beaumont's case, that means the print was made by him And it was made on or about the time the negative was made. So this photograph's from 1946. This print is from 1946. And there's stamping and signatures, and there's a lot to back that up. And there's also a lot a gallery would write up for you if you were to purchase a vintage print. Now this is what a modern print of that same photograph looks like. It's a lot larger, it looks different, it's darker, it's on a different paper, and it's of a particular size. Now Beaumont later in life actually preferred this look to his vintage look. But the market still tells us that this vintage print is more valuable. Often these vintage prints are sought after by collectors because there's a feeling that there's a purist part of them, that because the print was made when the picture was made, that it has more of the emotional intent of the artist. It's on a paper that was made at the time. It has a more beautiful interpretation. That's not always true. It depends on the artist. And honestly, Beaumont did like these modern prints better. Now, when Beaumont was asked by legendary dealer Harry Lund to produce a portfolio of his work, Beaumont, of course, agreed, but this was a limited edition portfolio, but Beaumont was concerned, well, what if people buy my portfolio and then break it up and start selling the prints on the market separately? Won't it compete with my modern prints or compete with my few vintage prints? So Beaumont, when it was time to do a portfolio, he had all of the prints made in the portfolio a unique size. So people who know Beaumont's market know if you see a print this size, it's from a portfolio, and there's 50 of them. Whereas if you see a print this size, you know it's an exhibition print, it's a modern print. If you see a print this size, it's a vintage print. All of these three prints, it's the same picture, but they all have very different values. In fact, thousands of dollars different in values. So, what else do we know about portfolios? Well, usually a portfolio print on the back has a label or a stamp that says it's from a portfolio. People feel basically that since the portfolio was kind of mass-produced, there were 25 made or 50 made or 100 made. Some people do a portfolio of 200. That's kind of adds a mechanical sense to the printing. Also, portfolios typically sell for less value. If this print, and I'm just making this up for the video, but let's say this print costs $3,000, and if there's 10 prints in a portfolio, it's not $30,000 typically. It's not 3,000 times 10. Typically, if it's from a portfolio, it was probably about half that price when the portfolio comes out. So it's a way that collectors could buy a larger body of work at a reduced price, but again, the prints are different. They're made with a different mindset, and typically they're a different size, and they have a different labeling. These are things that we need to know about vintage, modern, portfolio. Another thing I'd like to bring up at the moment is that this is one of Beaumont's color photographs. It's from Chichicastenango, Guatemala. Now, if you saw this print on the computer, it's being for sale on one of the various sites, you would see a description, it would have the title, it would have the date, it's signed. It has all of the right provenance for the piece. But you may or may not know that this print is terribly faded. It's a Type C print. It was made about 40 years ago, and it's not a very permanent process, which I explained in a previous video. And it happens that this same image is included in Beaumont's portfolio. But in Beaumont's portfolio, it's included as a dye transfer print, which is much more permanent color process. And as much as this portfolio is, I don't know, 30 years old, there's been no change to this print. So you have to be careful. You know, you could look at this and buy it online. You say, oh, it's a good price, and you're going to grab it. But then when you receive it, it's not what you thought. Of course, you would want one that looked like this, not one that looks like that. In fact, a print like this, to my mind, pretty much has no value at this point. It's so faded. It looks nothing like the print itself should look. Speaking about portfolios, as I said, it was an opportunity. Many photographers made a portfolio. What we look for in a portfolio is it has a title page. Portfolios typically have a table of contents. And for your knowledge as a collector, it has what we call a colophon sheet. And the colophon tells you how many portfolios were made, when it was made, what process was used, what number this portfolio was in the edition. It's basically everything you want to know. And one thing collectors have to be careful about. On occasion, one image from an artist might take on great value. All of a sudden, a certain picture becomes famous. Sometimes that image was included in a portfolio. And there's a temptation by some collectors and some dealers, quite frankly, to kind of break up the portfolio and start selling the prints separately just because one image might have so much more value than the others. In my experience, first of all, the artist never intends for a portfolio to be broken up. So there's a kind of an ethical or a moral discussion about breaking up portfolios. But also in my experience, portfolios in the long run always have a greater value if they're kept intact in the box with the colophon, and it's not missing one print that somebody might have sold 10 years ago. So I would encourage you, if you do collect limited edition portfolios, that you keep them together. You could hang them, rotate them on your wall, but I would discourage people from breaking up portfolios. In the work of the photographer Edward Weston, maybe there's I don't want to say the most confusion about his market, but there is a lot of confusion about his market because he certainly is the acknowledged master of 20th century photography, but there's three kinds of prints, and actually there's more than three kinds of prints, but in general terms, in Edward Weston's work, there are prints on the market that were made by Edward Weston. There are prints on the market that were printed by Edward's older son, Brett Weston, and those were called project prints. And late in Edward Weston's life, he and Edward and his sons, they selected about 800 of his most famous photographs, and they started printing them. Many of those prints are initialed, some of them are signed, some of them are initialed by Edward, some of them are initialed by Brett. It's a little confusing, but those prints are called project prints. Then there are prints made after Edward Weston's death by his son Cole Weston. And the Cole Weston prints were pretty common amongst the Edward Weston market, and you see more of those prints in galleries, at art shows, online, than you actually see of Edward Weston's own vintage prints. And again, here there's a difference not just of hundreds or thousands of dollars, but differences of hundreds of thousands of dollars. So how do you know? Typically, on the back of a print, we have some information. I mean, this is a well-known Edward Weston photograph, but as it happens, this print was made by his son Cole, and it says, negative by Edward Weston, print by Cole Weston. These have a certain value on the market. It's called a Cole Weston, Edward Weston print. It's another example of an Edward Weston print. I'll take it out of the mat. Now this too is a Cole Weston, Edward Weston print, but when we look at the back, it tells us something else. It tells us it's from this Denudo's portfolio. So one thing, it lets us know that although it's a Cole Weston, Edward Weston print, there's probably not as many of this print than the previous print because it was printed for this portfolio, and it says this is print number 5 from portfolio number 22, made in 1972. So this has a different value. Now the value is not, as I'm saying, the values are not solely based on the images themselves. Value is based on who printed it, when it was printed, how it is signed, how it is stamped, where did it come from, and of course the condition and the quality and the luminosity, actually the print quality itself. What we'll do for you in this week's newsletter that accompanies this video is we're going to put a full description for you about the Edward Weston prints, the project prints, the Cole prints, and we'll also reproduce for you the series of signatures and how those signatures vary on those different states of prints. So with the Edward Weston market, there's a lot to learn and a lot to know. And again, I worry that you look online and you see oh, Edward Weston print, $400. Oh, I just saw one for $400,000. This is a great bargain. Clearly, there's a difference. Is this a universal difference? No. The differences vary from artist to artist, from estate to estate. Here's a beautiful minor white photograph. Now a minor white exhibition print is typically, mounted, signed by minor white in the lower right. Sometimes it has information on the back. This one does. You're not going to be able to see it on the video, but it's titled and dated by minor white on the back. We could verify his handwriting. So this is clearly a minor white photograph that was made for exhibition. Now here's another minor white photograph. Looks beautiful. Looks great. It's one of his signature photographs. But when I open this mat, what do we find? Looks totally different. I'm going to remove it from the mat. And it's mounted on this small board. It has all these reference lines for inches. And what we see here is this is a reproduction print. This is a print that was made by minor white for a book. In those days, you had to print very contrasty, glossy. You had to print a specific way to get the best quality reproduction in your books. Photographers who made reproduction prints never intended for them to get on the market. They never intended them to be for sale. Unfortunately, we find today that I find them at auctions, I find them online, I see them quite a lot. You don't want to buy a print that was made for reproduction, of course. You want to buy a print that was made for exhibition. A print that's made for reproduction, as good as it is, might have a lot of value to a school or a museum as a study print or a study collection. It might have a lot of value for students, studying someone's work and seeing how they do it. But from a collector's perspective, they're not meant to be collected. They're not exhibition prints. So be careful. Usually a reproduction print is marked or mounted in a specific way, or it has certain characteristics about it that tells a knowledgeable person that this print wasn't made to be sold. Someone took this out of the publisher's offices, or someone took it out of a garbage can, for all I know. They're just not meant to be on the market. But again, sometimes prints do appear on the market. Another way to come by photographs is through limited edition books. These days, in the old days when a publisher wanted to publish your book, you might know they gave the author an advance, and you had like a year and a half to meet the deadline, and they paid for everything, and the book was done, and then they would send you on a tour to sign books. Well, those days are long gone, and today most artists that have books published have to pay what's considered a subvention. Pretty much what that means is most photographers today have to contribute to the publication of their books because there's not a large enough book buying public for fine art photography books. So it's not uncommon to, it's still the same hassle finding a publisher for your work. But once you found that publisher, you are asked to contribute. And the way a lot of artists go about making that contribution is when the book comes out, they'll make a special edition of the book, which is in a slip case. Try to lift this up so you can see it. It's in a slip case. It might have a special cloth cover. Inside there's a colophon page that tells you what number. Let's say there are 50 limited edition books made. They'll be signed and numbered. And often they will contain an original print by the artist. So here again, if an artist's work sells, and I'm making this up, this happens to be by Luis Gonzalez Palma, and I introduced you to his work last week. Now, his prints, and I'm going to make up prices so I'm not quoted, but let's say his prints sell for $2,500. This limited edition might have sold for $500. It had a special edition of the book, it had a special edition of the print. The print now is numbered 31 of 100, and it's of this photograph, which on the trade edition is the cover of the book. So it's a very well-known photograph, it's a beautiful print, but here it is, this size. Now, if you just saw this in a catalog or online and you were just buying this picture, you might say, oh, I saw that picture in a gallery for a few $1,000s, now I could get it for $500. And you can, and it's beautiful, and it is what it is. But an exhibition print of this photograph looks like this. It's very different. So the print that you saw in a gallery for a few $1,000s looked like this. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this smaller print. It's a beautiful print. It's from a limited edition book. But you have to know when you're buying something and you're just looking at the image and the price, that it's not necessarily the same thing. They've come onto the market two completely different ways. Let me move this. Another example of a limited edition is this Dandelion book that was produced by Aperture, I believe. It's Pictures from the New World. Now this book was a limited edition book. It has a colophon inside. It's signed and numbered. And it came with this print. Now in this case, this print is pretty much the same size that Dandelion released this into the market as his exhibition print. And truth is, there's not much difference between a single exhibition print of this and the print that came from the book. Now on the back of the print there is stamping differences. He stamped his exhibition prints a certain way and the prints on this book are notated in a different way. However, I would guess that the market for this print is pretty close to the market of his singular prints that were made for exhibition. So in this case, I'm saying those who took advantage of buying, and there's 200 of these, by the way, made, and I don't know that he sold 200 of his other images, but I would say in this case, those who took advantage of the opportunity to buy this Dandelion book when it came out, probably, and I hate to put it purely in financial terms, not in aesthetic terms, but financially they probably did pretty great because that print is pretty valuable on today's market. Now Ansel Adams, of course, is always in the news. And this is an interesting, actually pretty rare Ansel Adams photograph. This is a photograph of Alfred Barr, who is the first director of the Museum of Modern Art. And it was actually under Alfred Barr that Beaumont Newhall was hired, and the first department of photography was started at the museum, and Ansel was one of the board members, and he and Beaumont, through this, became, of course, great friends and lifelong collaborators. Now, this print Ansel made for Beaumont for an article that Beaumont was writing. And so, of course, Beaumont called Ansel and said, "Ansel, could you make me a print of Alfred Barr, that beautiful picture you took? I'd like to use it in my article." So Ansel made this print. First of all, it's not mounted, which is very unusual for an Ansel Adams print because he always mounted his prints. So the fact that it's loose makes it already kind of an odd thing and somewhat suspicious. Is this, what kind of Ansel Adams print is this? So of course on the back we see Ansel signed it. It's funny, he didn't know the exact date. He wrote 19 and a couple of dots, and those of you who know about the history of the Moonrise and it's all different dates, it's kind of funny that Ansel, because he wasn't so careful with his dating. But it says here, it says photograph for reproduction only. And then it's signed by Ansel Adams. So Ansel, although he sent this to one of his best friends, he also wanted to make sure that this print never appears on the open market by writing on the back that it is not meant for sale. Now, I have to say, of course, prints have come up of Ansel's for sale that were made for reproduction. They shouldn't. It's not right. Ansel wouldn't have wanted it. It's actually possibly illegal because Ansel's estate watches carefully to make sure reproductions are not sold, as does Cartier-Bresson's estate and many artists' estates. They don't want prints on the market, but they have a way of appearing, and one has to be careful. Again, we're not just buying pictures. We're buying prints. We want to know how they're mounted, how they're signed, who made them, when they were made, how they were marked. Now, this is probably Ansel's most famous photograph, the Moonrise. Now, in this case, one really needs to have a doctorate in connoisseurship, because the values of the Moonrise can vary from the tens of thousands of dollars to the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And they could be the same size, but the prints are not the same, the signatures are not the same, the board that the prints are mounted on are not the same, and the stamp that Ansel used are not the same. And over Ansel's lifetime, from the 40s until his death in the 80s, there's at least 10 different versions of this image in terms of how dark the sky is, how much detail is shown in these subtle clouds here on the right, and there's a preference by collectors to kind of prefer the prints that have the most detail in them. So the earlier the prints are, the more detail they have. Also, this notion of vintage, the earlier prints they are, have a different interpretation. And there are interpretations of this print where the sky is a light gray. So over time, Ansel's darkroom technique changed, how he procedures he did on the negative to intensify the negative and increase the contrast. There's so many versions, and when you see a Moonrise for X amount of money, and then you see a Moonrise that just sold, let's say, for $700,000, I assure you they weren't the same print. They were the same picture, but not the same print. And also what we'll do in today's newsletter is one of the ways as dealers that we help date when a print was made by Ansel is his signature changed over his lifetime. So there's a whole chart we'll post of all of Ansel's different signatures and what years he used what signature. Did he underline his name? Did he not underline his name? Did he put the horizontal on the A with a flourish, or did he put it straight? Is it written big? Is it written small? There's so much to study with all his signatures. And of course the boards. Ansel changed his mounting board over time. Okay, well, let's move on and talk about the photographer Elliot Porter. So Elliott Porter, during his lifetime, produced quite a number of portfolios, and in my mind, maybe more portfolios than any other photographer that I know of. His first portfolio, I don't know if you see the embossing here on the video, but we could put it in a newsletter. It was called The Seasons, Portfolio 1. This portfolio was made by Elliott. He printed the prints himself in his darkroom. It was made for the Sierra Club. The colophon sheets, you'll see it says Seasons, Portfolio 1. It has information, as I said before. It has a table of contents. It has a statement by Elliott. And we have our colophon information. How many portfolios? This is a limited edition of 105 copies, of which 100 were for sale. And this happens to be copy number 38. It contains 12 prints. And as I said, these were printed by Elliott in his studio. You'll see the size is the size that he preferred, and the mounting is the size that he preferred. I'll just look at one or two of the prints. But prints from this portfolio are identified as such. The back of the portfolio, the back of the prints have a stamp. It says Portfolio 1, The Seasons, Elliott Porter. This is, what print this is, from set number 38, published by the Sierra Club, 1963. So the information on the back of this print tells us this is from the Seasons portfolio. The colophon also tells us that it was printed by Elliott in Elliott's studio. Prints from this portfolio have one specific value as a portfolio, and if by chance a print was taken out of the portfolio for a reason, it has a certain value. Elliott's second portfolio made was called Iceland, and it's actually called Iceland Portfolio 2. And I think the decision Elliott made after printing the Seasons portfolio, which took him almost 2 years. Imagine 105 portfolios times 12. You do the math. It took him nearly 2 years to print this portfolio. So it's not only 2 years in the darkroom making prints, but it's also 2 years away from other work that he wanted to be doing during that time. So it was after the printing of this portfolio that Elliott decided he himself was no longer going to print portfolios. And at that time he started to look for premier dye transfer labs in the United States, of which there were very few. There was one in Florida, which we'll talk about in a moment, where the Iceland portfolio was printed. And his later portfolios were printed by a laboratory in New York called Berkey K&L, which kind of is known as a premier dye transfer laboratory. But the Seasons portfolio, which Elliott produced but didn't print, but it has kind of the same kind of slipcase. You'll see the formatting is very much the same. It has a sheet, Portfolio 2 Iceland. It has a statement by Elliott along with a table of contents. And in this colophon, it also tells us how many portfolios were made. 100 were made, 10 artist proofs. This is portfolio number 75, and it also says that this was printed by the Color Corporation of America in Florida. Now, these prints, in turn, not the images yet, but the prints, the mounting, the size, you'll see they look very much like the prints I've shown you previously. The prints are beautiful, they're of the highest quality. Elliott, as many of you know, had very high standards for quality when it came to printing, and maybe when it came to him not printing, the standards were even higher, because he wanted to make sure the prints were as perfect as he would have made himself. So when we look at the Iceland prints, again, they're beautiful Elliott Porter prints. But when we look in the back, we're told this print is from Portfolio 2, Iceland, Elliott Porter. It's print number 2 from set number 25, published by the author in 1975. So prints from this portfolio have another value. The seasons, we know that there's at least 100 prints of each of those images. They have a value. Elliott printed those himself. Prints from the Iceland portfolio have a different value. There's also about 100 of each, or 110 images, prints of each image, but they were printed by a laboratory under Elliott's supervision. But because they were printed under supervision and not by Elliott himself, they have another value. Now another value for an Elliott Porter print would be a print that Elliott made himself, not from a portfolio. So once we're starting to talk about prints that Elliott made, we know there's 100 or so of prints from portfolios, but with an image like this, which Elliott printed and exhibited, possibly sold, there's considerably less than 100. This particular print is Elliott's Redbud image. It's one of his most sought after photographs. It was the cover of the catalog for the exhibition that he had at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And because it was the cover of the catalog, and of course because of a beautiful print and a beautiful image, it has great value. And the back of this print tells us that this is from Elliott's studio itself, and the print was made by Elliott. So having a print that was made in less of an edition, made by the artist hand, kind of made, when he went into the darkroom, he probably made one print. He didn't go in the darkroom and make others. That enhances the value. As it turns out, if one was seeking this image, an edition, which he didn't print but is quite beautiful, but an edition of 25 were made this size. Now, if you were looking in a catalog or looking online and were looking for a print of the Redbud, you know, both of these prints would be reproduced the same size. You wouldn't know that this was this beautiful, gigantic image. This was just 25 of those. They were printed by that lab I mentioned, Berkeley K&L. And then here's the print that Elliott made himself in the darkroom, of which, as I said, there's considerably less. So these are just an example of, 4 different kinds of Elliott Porter prints. Beautiful quality, beautiful dye transfer prints, all supervised by Elliott. He was involved with the printing of all of them, but he only actually physically himself printed this print and the prints from the Seasons portfolio. But there are 4 different kinds of prints with 4 different values. These are just some of the things that I try to bring to your attention today that might affect value. Of course, the condition of a print, the condition of the mount, that affects the value. When it was made, who made it? Was it posthumously made? Was it printed by a lab? Is it on a paper that's no longer made? Is it something special? Was the print in an exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art? Was the print used for a reproduction in a newspaper? All of these things that we need to know about a print and know about the way an artist works all affect value. And it could get very confusing when you're looking for an image and then you start seeing different prices attached to that image. It can get very confusing. I want to repeat again that there is an organization called APAD, which is the International Society of Photographic Art Dealers, AIPAD. There's a website. There's members all over the world. All these galleries are vetted by this organization. They're all fine art photography dealers. They're incredibly knowledgeable, and I'm sure there's one in your region. And when the virus is over and you could again start to frequent galleries and museums, I would encourage you to seek out one of these galleries, and I assure you the people in that gallery will be your professors. They will be glad to start teaching you about a particular artist's work. Once you start identifying a genre of work you want to collect or an artist's work you want to collect, you have to start studying them, getting books of their work, getting books on the history of photography, see where they fit in, see what's unique about them. How did they print? Did they print in platinum? Did they print in silver? Are there large prints? Are there small prints? Learn about the market, and you can develop a connoisseurship for yourself, and you can build the best quality collection that you can. Now, I realized I use a lot of terms in this video, and I might have used some words interchangeably. I just want to reiterate some of these terms. And in the newsletter for this week's video, I will put a little glossary of terms on the newsletter. So if you take the time to read the newsletter that goes with this video, all this information will be there, as well as details of signatures and labels and some of the things about these prints. But when I use the term vintage, typically it's kind of a vague definition, but a vintage print is a print that was made on or about the time the negative was made. Most artists did their own printing, especially in their early days. There are some photographers, many of the European photographers, that always had their work printed by laboratories, or they had a printer that just worked for them. Those would still be considered vintage prints. It really is dependent on the artist. But if you have a print that was made really early by a photographer, on or about the time the negative was made, that would be a vintage print. Then I use the word modern prints. And the word modern print is pretty much any prints that were made after vintage, later. These are loose terms, so I'm just going to say if an image was made in 1935 and you have a print that you know was printed in 1935, maybe 1937, 1938, that's probably still considered a vintage print. Maybe 1940 also. It depends. If the paper was the same, the size is the same, the interpretation is the same. So a vintage print could be a few years even after the image was made. But 10 years later, or a paper change, or an interpretation, it's darker, it's more contrasty now, it's a larger size. Once we see that change, then we start referring to, you'll see a label and a gallery will say, it could say a vintage print, or it might say printed later. If it says printed later, that's kind of how I'm using the word modern print. It's made later. It is possible, of course, if you have someone who's, worked 50 or 60 years, there might be vintage prints, later prints, and then modern prints. Maybe later in their life, they had some kind of infirmity. Edward Weston, he developed Parkinson's disease when those project prints were being printed by his sons, Brett and Cole. He was impaired. He was in the darkroom, he was supervising, so those certainly would be considered modern prints. They were printed later, way later, and they were not printed by him, but he was there. So we need to kind of agree on these terms. I use also terms like provenance. When I use the word provenance, and I know I've used it a little interchangeably today, provenance actually, we're talking about whose hands was that print in. Provenance really refers to when it changed hands. So the provenance of a print could be that the print came directly from the artist. It could be that it went directly from the artist to the artist's son, to the gallery, to you as the buyer. So the provenance would show 4 changes of hands. A gallery should supply you with a letter of provenance pretty much when you buy a photograph. Sometimes the provenance would be from the artist to an unnamed collector to an auction house, and then you purchase the print at auction. And then we would say from the artist to an unnamed collector to an auction from 1987 in Paris on a certain particular date. So when we're talking about provenance, We're actually talking about the chain of ownership of that print, and that becomes very important in terms of value, because different provenance can increase values. I mean, if you have a print that was bought, on eBay, that print and that provenance would be, from the artist, let's say, to a collector to eBay, as opposed to, let's say, from the artist to a collector to the Museum of Modern Art, and then they deaccessioned it at Sotheby's auction in a certain date. That changes everything, that this print was from a museum collection. And now, so sometimes provenance can affect value as well. So you want to know that chain of command when we talk about provenance. There's no one perfect word when I talk about all these different states of prints. Again, we could have the same image, it could have been printed by the artist, it could have come from a portfolio, it could have come from a limited edition book, it could have come, some other way. But, I've showed you some prints today where we see the same image in different examples. That's more talking of what I like to call the state of the print. This is a portfolio print. This is from a limited edition book. This was a print that the artist made for specific exhibition or something like that. I also want to reiterate that a portfolio is like an original book. When an artist produces a limited edition portfolio, often, and now I'm talking as a photographer even more so than a dealer, it's kind of something that the artist is looking to attain a closure on a project. With Elliot Porter, let's say, he spent years photographing in Iceland. When that work was finished, that was the occasion to try to produce, for him to select, what he felt were his 12 finest images from those years of work on that one subject, and kind of put them together in one unit for the public to appreciate. He didn't intend, and I don't think any artist intends for these portfolios to be broken up. It's almost, it's kind of it becomes an object unto itself. The same passion that goes into making a print for an exhibition goes into the producing of a portfolio. It's painstaking work. Every print is made with care. Then typically you choose a box maker. You all the way to find someone who could print letterpress, make a beautiful colophon sheets. These productions are fine productions. So the only thing to note about a print coming from a portfolio is that typically there are more prints made of that particular image because it was in a portfolio. And that probably has much to do with the fact that portfolio prints on the financial end of things sometimes attain a lesser value than what I might call a singular print that was just made if somebody just went to that artist and said, I'd like a print of just that picture. But clearly, and then I'll say the same with those limited edition book prints. Often they're printed smaller, they're a different size, but they're printed with the same love and the same care that an artist puts into all of their work. Do all these things affect value? Yes. And it's important for you to not only know all that, but before you're buying an image, you want to know basically what you're buying. You might, purchase a print of an image and you love it and you like it until you go to a museum show and you'll see that same picture and it's printed differently, and you say, boy, I wish I knew it was made like that before I bought this. And it's for that reason. You should see what's available to you, and then you could basically make an educated decision. I thank you for joining us today. I know this particular video is probably more lengthy than the others. This is a very complicated subject, but I don't know that I answered a lot of your questions, but I think I hopefully brought up a lot of questions. And hopefully now you have enough questions that you could seek the answers for yourself. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again soon. Take care.